And so we'll continue to listen into Donald Trump, but as he continues to make what are provably wrong statements and confuse certain things and go off on tangents, I want to go back, if I can, to Lisa Rubin. And Lisa, he did a lot of name dropping there. He went off, as I said, on a number of different tangents. But what's your takeaway from what he had to say?
Well, Chris, I'm having trouble hearing you right now, but one of the things I heard the former president say in his statements was reiterating his constant line that this is an example of Biden-led interference. That's exactly what Judge Merchan found today, was not what is going on. In fact, what he found was that the Manhattan DA's office was not responsible for the belated transmission of materials relating to Michael Cohen's prosecution by the Southern District of New York, because that office is not under the control of the DA, not under the direction of the DA, and he found no evidence that those offices were doing anything but meeting together in the ordinary course to exchange materials subject to a court order, not colluding between them, as the former president is very fond of saying. He also talked just now about Matthew Colangelo. Mr. Colangelo is the lead lawyer today in court for the Manhattan DA's office. Yes, he is also a veteran of the New York Attorney General's office, where he met Alvin Bragg, the now elected district attorney. He has also spent some time at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. But again, this is the former president trying to confuse folks watching by alleging somehow that this is evidence of collusion between state and federal governments and offices of law enforcement when there's been no proof to that point in court or otherwise, Chris.
And in fact, there were points today in court where the judge pushed back, saying you don't have any proof of what you're alleging here. But I want to go to MSNBC senior political analyst Matthew Dowd. And Matthew, you could argue that taken on its face, there is one thing that Donald Trump said that is true, which is this has never been done in this country before. What he wasn't referencing, but where that is true, is we've never had a former president who is facing 4 criminal trials, nearly 90 counts of indictments, that we have never before had a former president who is facing 2 huge judgments against him in civil cases. But we're going to go back to him when there is Q&A, when we're able to ask questions, when journalists are able to ask questions. But your take on what you're seeing from Donald Trump today, even on a day when arguably he got a big win.
Well, I mean, I think you're exactly right. It's typical delusional Donald Trump, as we've watched over the last 6 or 7 years, and how he tries to spin what's reality into some fiction and hope the 40% of the country that buys into it will keep buying into it. I would say there was 2 things that he said that were truthful today. Is the one you mentioned, which truthful in a different way, as well as this is election interference, which he's right. It is about election interference, but not against him, but perpetrated by him and his surrogates and people around him, which is why these trials are all sort of necessary and important. The thing that I find fascinating is every time Donald Trump has gone to trial, every single time Donald Trump has gone to trial, or his people have gone to trial, whether it's over election fraud or whatever, the trial courts have all rejected what he said as completely mythic and made up and you know, wanting him to stop this stuff. And they present a fact set with evidence that needs to be presented in this. And that's the problem Donald Trump has. But he does have an unnatural sway over 40% of the country. And, you know, it is something that is exceedingly concerning that he can say and do anything, and 40% of the country will go along with it.
Well, speaking of saying anything, Matthew, one of the things he continues to say is anything that happens bad in the world, anything happens that could be construed as negative in the United States, he says to an issue, this would not have happened if I were president, right? Absolutely unprovable, and in many cases, given any kind of analysis, highly, highly unlikely. Having said that, 40% of the country that will buy that, 40% of the country who would think that if he were president, we would be in much better shape, does not win you the presidency. So from a political standpoint, what are you seeing here today?
I mean, I think we've seen it, and we saw it throughout the primaries, is that he seems only concerned with that 40%. So I actually think he's given up on the idea of winning the popular vote in this country. Like, he's never won it. He didn't win it in 2020, he didn't win it in 2016, though he won the Electoral College in 2016, as we all know. And I think that's his strategy. I think the idea that he would somehow move to the center and be more rational and disciplined and appeal to the next 10 or 12% that would get him a majority of vote in the country is not something that he's interested in at all. So I think what was revealed today and every other day is his total strategy is to motivate that 40% in key states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Arizona and Georgia, hoping that that will be enough if he motivates his supporters to win the Electoral College. But I would say, by and large, his campaign and him has completely given up on the idea that they're going to win a majority of the popular vote of the country.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.